In a previous video, we talked about the graph editor. Just to remind you, we can find the graph editor by going to Windows, Animation Editor, Graph Editor, and it will open up a standalone window of the graph editor. We can also find it by changing our workspace. And although I strongly encourage you to get in here and play around with the graph editor so you'll start to understand it earlier, I'm not going to dig too deep into it in this video. The thing I do want you to notice, though, is that there is a keyframe on every channel at the same point in our timeline. Later in this lesson, you're going to learn about the 12 principles of animation, and you're going to learn about pose-to-pose animation. The thing you should recognize is that each of these keyframes is the same thing as me establishing a pose. I have told Maya that on frame 56, I need this arrow to be in exactly this location and this orientation and at this scale on frame 56. And I did that by setting a keyframe on all of the attributes that I can control. So, if I need to change any of the timing on this animation, it's very important that all of these attributes have a keyframe on them. One of the things that I'll sometimes do is I will make sure, just by stepping through these keyframes and hitting S. To step through these keys, you can use the greater than, less than keys, which are also the comma and the period keys. So if I hit S on frame 1, I make sure that there's a keyframe on everything, and then I can step forward to my next keyframe using the greater than and less than keys. This will allow us to see each of the keys in our animation and make sure that there's a keyframe on them. So step forward, hit S, step forward, hit S, and I'm just doing this to make sure that all of my attributes have a keyframe. The reason for that is because now I can adjust sections of my timeline without having to worry about messing up any of my animation. So for instance, if I wanted my arrow to anticipate back and then launch into this animation, and if I wanted all of this animation to go much faster and get to this end pose earlier, then I could just grab all of these keyframes in the middle and scale that in to a much faster animation, and then again right click and hit snap to make sure it snaps them to whole keyframes. Now what we get is a slower transition into the second keyframe and a slower transition to the last keyframe, but all of the animation in the middle is much faster. That gives me a little bit more room at the beginning and the end to add some extra animation to this arrow. I'm going to copy the keyframe from frame 1 by right-clicking and going to copy, and then I'll paste that keyframe on frame 35. Paste, paste. And rather than anticipating backwards, I will anticipate in the opposite direction that the arrow is getting ready to travel. So I'll move the arrow down, back, and rotate it to point up. It's also important to recognize that I could start playing around with my squash and stretch now. If I wanted to put a keyframe on my scale, I could also scale my arrow down and out to give it a little bit of squash. And again, hit S. And so now my animation does that. If I wanted to make it even more impactful, I could make this keyframe even closer to the next keyframe by holding Shift and clicking to highlight that keyframe and sliding it closer. Now my transition from my anticipation pose to here is much faster. I'm going to adjust my timing just a little bit more in order to speed that up. Now, I can also add some additional animation to the end. If I want my arrow to get to this ending pose and kind of shoot past it or overshoot it, I can right click on that key pose and hit copy, and we'll paste that somewhere around frame 99. And I will take this arrow even further past it to make it feel like it went a little too far and had to back up. So I'm going to show you one more trick. Sometimes I don't want the exact keyframe. So for example, if I were to copy frame 1 and paste it on frame 30, my arrow stays in the exact same location from frame 1 to 30. And sometimes that's not what I want. Sometimes I want it to move a little bit more. Animators call this a moving hold. So we want it to stay pretty much in the same location, but we don't want it to feel completely dead or still. So if I move from frame 1 to, say, frame 5, you see we get a little bit of motion in between there. So really what I want to copy is what is on frame 5, but currently frame 5 doesn't have a keyframe on it. There's a couple of different ways I can do this. One way I could do this is to just go ahead and create a keyframe on frame 5 and then shift click frame 5 in order to highlight it and just move it to frame 30. So now I get that same transition that happened from 1 to 5 happening from 1 to 30. This will make our arrow feel like it's still continuing to stay alive before it moves. There's another way we can do this as well. If I want my arrow to get back to this resting pose a little earlier, but not completely to this resting pose. Maybe I want it to get back to, let's say, frame 117. I just want it to be in this location around frame 105. One of the things I can do is if I middle click on my timeline and drag, you'll notice that my frame doesn't update. Although I'm moving to a different spot on my timeline, the object is staying in the same location. So that means I can middle click on frame 115 and drag back to, say, frame 105, and my object is still in the same location that it was on frame 115. And that means I can hit S to set a keyframe on this object. Now when I move my timeline, we'll have that keyframe. So if I hit play again, now again, this still needs a little bit of timing cleanup. For example, I think that's probably a little too fast, so I can shift those keys down. And I kind of feel like all of this animation through the middle is still just a little bit too slow. So maybe I would speed it up. Speed it up just a little bit more. Move that closer and snap. And so if I hit play, now I'm getting something like this. Again, the animator needs to be in complete control of where this object moves. The more pieces of data you can give Maya, the more precisely you can control the animation.